Every year, between 1.2 to 1.6 million people are killed around the world as a result of armed violence and war. That includes the mother who was shot by her 2-year-old child, who found a gun in her handbag while she was shopping at Walmart. That includes those who are killed as a result of gang violence and police brutality, gang wars in El Salvador and Mexico. And it includes those who are being killed today in wars in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, the Congo, and elsewhere. The impact and effects of violence and war on our societies and on our communities includes far more, though, than just those who've been killed. For every person who dies in war, there are at least 10 others who have been injured. There are the families and parents, the children of those who have lost people that they love. And there's the physical destruction of schools, homes, lost opportunities for investment. It's estimated that in the Middle East alone, as a result of the wars after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there's been more than $12 trillion in destroyed infrastructure and lost investment in the region. We have today an unparalleled capacity to wage war. We can destroy cities, buildings, and infrastructure through bombings and drone strikes. We can give 18-year-olds guns, which they can use to kill and eliminate those we call enemies. But we have not developed as effectively our capacity to actually solve and deal with conflicts. In Iraq alone, it's estimated that as a result of the wars in the country from the 1980s until today, the country is at least 30 times poorer than it would have been without war. In Syria, a country that was once championed by the United Nations for its progress on achieving the Millennium Development Goals, more than 75% of the population now lives in poverty. Over 60% of all hospitals and schools have been destroyed. When people hear these statistics, when we see the images and pictures of war from around the world, one of the feelings that most people have is powerlessness. We think that nothing can be done to change this. I've spent the last 20 years working in some of the most violence and war-affected communities and countries in the world. In Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, Sri Lanka, Northern Ireland, El Salvador, Colombia, and elsewhere. And while in that time, I've been brought face to face with many things which no human being should ever have to see, no community should ever have to live with, I've also had the opportunity to meet with incredible individuals and organizations, often those who have been worse affected by violence and war, taking practical steps to work to overcome it, to work to help their communities heal, to prevent violence, and to build lasting peace. What I would like to use the next moments for us to explore together are both what are some of the myths and ideas around war and peace that are leading us to deal with conflicts in the way that we do, but also to share together what are some of the practical things actually being done and what can we do today to deal with conflicts more effectively. If we start with 5 myths about war, the first is that it's natural. But war isn't like earthquakes or tsunamis or hurricanes. War is not something natural. It's a direct result of our building up the institutions and capacities for war. In one way, you might even look at it as a system failure. War is what happens when we don't deal with conflicts well and effectively in our communities, in our countries, in the world. But the challenge with this is that war isn't only a system failure, we have actually built up a system of war. Every single year, we spend around $1.7 trillion on the production and development of weapons and the maintenance of armies. If that figure seems a little big, that's $3.2 million every minute to be able to carry out war. We have over 20 million people in uniform in armed services in any moment, and millions more who are in guerrilla forces, insurgencies, what we today call terrorist organizations, and millions more than that still in armed gangs in countries around the world. We've built up ministries of war or ministries of defense, training academies, weapons industries. But in how many of our countries do we have ministries of peace or ministries which look at how to deal with conflicts effectively? In how many of our countries are we practically training people with the proven skills and tools for how to deal with conflicts effectively? So war, in fact, is not natural. It's the result both of failures in our systems and institutions, and it's the result over hundreds of years of investment and development of institutions and systems of war. We're also often told that it's inevitable. It's part of human nature. There's nothing we can do about it. We've always had war, we'll always have war. But history teaches us a different lesson. We've actually seen a dramatic reduction in the number of armed conflicts that are happening around the world. The likelihood of dying a violent death from war today is dramatically less than in almost any previous century. No other choice. This is one of the messages that we hear often from politicians as they embark their countries, our countries, upon the path to war. We've tried everything else, we've been left with no other choice. Having spent 20 years working in situations of armed conflict, often being invited as an international facilitator and mediator or working to assist parties in conflict, one of the major challenges that we face today is not that we go to war because there's no other choice, but because we go to war having failed to develop or explore any other opportunities. And something that we hear continuously in media and political messaging is that war happens because they are evil. It's what the other side has done, because nothing can convince them except violence. The challenge is that all sides say that about each other. And one of the most damaging and dangerous myths that we have about war is that it works. And this is one of the things we really need to examine and explore today. The reality is the invasion of Iraq didn't help to solve problems, it created more in the region. And you can look throughout history, armed violence and war are not a solution to conflict. They actually make the problems worse. There's another myth, which is often widely held, that war happens because of vested interests, because big business benefits from war. I was asked to give a speech in Bahrain last year by the Crown Prince of Bahrain to 500 of the largest business and economic interests across the Middle East and the Gulf Cooperation Council. And they asked me to speak about the economic benefits of peace. One of the things we did as we prepared for that talk is we looked at what were the actual economic impacts of war, and we went industry by industry, sector by sector for countries across the region. And what we saw is that while some business does benefit, weapons industry, black market, drugs trade, prostitution and trafficking in women, and sex slavery, the overwhelming majority of industry, the overwhelming majority of business and economic interests and people suffer. What about peace? There are a number of different myths about peace. That it's naive, that it's idealistic, that all we need is to love each other, or that we begin with inner peace and only by looking within can we then have world peace. Some people seem to think that peace will just happen. We don't need to prepare, we don't need to train, we don't need to do things for it, peace will just happen. Or the idea that what we're doing now works, our diplomacy, our military, that our current tools work. There's nothing naive about working to find practical solutions to some of the most challenging conflicts and issues that face us in the world today. There's nothing idealistic about being faced with men and women, children and elderly who are dying because of war and working on the ground to try to find solutions and see how to stop it. And while I would absolutely love for all of us to love each other, and it is an important element to build empathy, to build respect and understanding for others, and inner peace is incredibly important. One thing we often don't pay attention to is that far more people actually die from suicide than all the wars in the world put together. And those are people who are dying as a result of conflicts, inner conflicts, conflicts within families, conflicts within communities. But while inner peace is important, it is not enough to deal with preventing violence in communities that are resulting from negative structures and negative systems. And it won't just happen. It takes effort. So let's look then at what are some of the things that are being done, what are some of the things that we can do practically to help deal with conflicts. And we're seeing these things being done around the world, and when they're being done, we're seeing that it works. We've actually had, over the last years, dramatic reduction in violent conflict in many countries around the world, but we've also been able to prevent violence and war from breaking out in the first place. Some of the critical efforts we need to support more to strengthen local peace capacities, to not expect always that it's the Security Council in New York or decisions taken by governments around the world. Conflicts happen, break out, are experienced on the ground in communities where people are. This is a picture of women's peace teams from South Sudan that have been supported through an organization called Nonviolent Peace Force. They work with women who've often themselves been survivors of violence, rape, or displaced as a result of the war, and they train them in proven and effective techniques of mediation, civilian peacekeeping, and community-based conflict resolution. And they're working within and between communities to reduce violence. Another practical tool that's being developed all over the world are what we call local peace committees or local peace councils. In these, people who are trusted by their communities are brought together, and using combinations of both traditional approaches and training in dialogue and mediation and violence prevention skills, they're helping to reduce violent incidents and to transform conflicts effectively within their communities. In Nepal, for example, one of the programs set up led to over 22,000 disputes within communities being resolved through nonviolent mediation. Training people. In a discussion I had with one of the most senior staff at the United Nations, whose job it is to deal with these issues, I asked her once how many people within the UN system who have in their terms of reference, in their job description, crisis management, violence prevention, mediation, how many of them really get it? And she said, if I'm generous, less than 2%. Over the last 20 years, I've been involved in training more than 4,000 practitioners, policymakers, activists from over 70 countries around the world. And while I have met with people with incredible passion and commitment and dedication, unfortunately, we're still in a situation today where far too people have actually been trained in the skills and tools they need to be able to do this work effectively on the ground. So again, while we have 20 million people trained for war, we have incredibly few who are trained knowing how to establish early warning systems, to facilitate community-based mediation, or to work in communities that have been devastated by war to help reconciliation and healing after. Create practical mechanisms. Here's another picture of Nonviolent Peace Force. Since international military peacekeeping was often not working, 80 organizations from 62 countries around the world came together and they created a civilian peacekeeping mechanism. And they're now deploying civilian peacekeepers in South Sudan, Syria, Burma, many of the worst violence-affected communities around the world, and it is working. Early warning and prevention. Developing the analytical tools and systems which help us to understand and identify conflicts years and decades before they become violent. and to be able to take practical measures and actions to address the underlying issues and needs so that violence doesn't break out in the first place. And these systems are being set up. All across Africa, we have a continent-wide early warning system. There are systems in many countries to help us monitor and understand violence dynamics. But again, we need to do it better. For example, in Mexico, there are what they call violence observatories. They focus on identifying and counting where people have been killed, where people have been injured, but they don't look at understanding the root causes, at looking at what are the factors contributing to it, and identifying what are the measures, the practical steps that can be taken to help deal with those conflicts effectively. We also need to revisit some of our key concepts in the field. For many years, for example, one of the main terms we've used is peacekeeping. And when you ask people all over the world, what do you think of when you hear the term peacekeeping, people say blue helmets, the United Nations. And this is important. A lot of peacekeeping is done by the United Nations, by the African Union, and others. But the overwhelming majority of peacekeeping is actually done by local people in their own communities. The point, the function of peacekeeping is preventing violence. It's not about solving the conflicts. It's not about addressing the root causes. But it's about trying to create a safe space where violence doesn't happen. And often, when you bring a military force in, even under UN helmets, it becomes a target. It can become part of the problem. What we're seeing instead is that by training unarmed local peace teams, or for example, engaging with tribal elders and community leaders, you can have a much greater impact in preventing violence. Peacemaking. Peacemaking is a term that we normally use for negotiations and official talks. What's happening in Geneva to deal with Syria, or this is a picture from talks dealing with the situation in Cyprus. And the picture that comes to people's mind is men in suits. But the reality is, the overwhelming majority of peacemaking is being done by local communities. The function and the purpose of peacemaking is to actually bring parties together to agree on how to deal with the issues in conflict. One of the problems we have today is that most of this, as we see it internationally, being dominated by high-level government officials and men in suits, is that the very people who are being most affected are those who are excluded. And even though United Nations resolutions 1320 and 1880 call for the empowerment and support for women to play key leadership roles in peace negotiations, they're still largely excluded. A third term is peace building. And here the focus up until recently has been what is done after war by international actors intervening. We need to move this upstream. Peace building isn't only about what happens after war. It's about dealing with conflicts before they become violent. It's about strengthening the capacity of communities and countries to end wars while they're happening and support reconciliation and healing after. Learning, sharing, and improving. Gathering experiences from what's being done around the world and really seeing in practice what we can do that works. Reconciliation and healing after violence and war. This is a picture of Jo Barry. Her father was killed in one of the largest bombings ever in Northern Ireland when the IRA tried to kill Margaret Thatcher. This is a picture of Patrick McGee, the man who did this bombing, which killed her father. Through a difficult journey, they met and began engaging with each other, working to understand each other. And now they travel together around the world in Lebanon, in Rwanda, in communities and countries affected by war, using their story to help inspire people to find the courage to work for peace. Empowering women at every level, not just to take part, but to play leadership roles. This is a picture from a program that I'm leading in Iraq with support from the United Nations of women who were kidnapped and abducted by ISIS, but who have survived and are now receiving support both in dealing with their own trauma and experience, but also to begin engaging together with other communities working for peace building. And we need to build better institutions. Part of the major reason why we have war in those countries still affected is that the institutions that we have are not working. They're often built on zero-sum control of power or allowing leadership from one community or another to monopolize power over others. And we need to work to evolve collaborative leadership and real systems that help our communities meet the needs of all of the sectors of our populations while dealing with the real issues and challenges we're facing. Another challenge is to make peace studies practical. We had 20 programs in the world 30 years ago. Today we have more than 500, but most of them are still too theoretical. We need to try and see how we can make it practical. Just the last things, a critical challenge is to also overcome the cultures of war. The ideas and belief systems which make war seem natural, inevitable, or legitimate. And I've chosen here to show pictures of ISIS, Islamic State, in Syria and Iraq. Here's a picture of a young child who's part of ISIS's program recruiting children to train the new elite soldiers because they face the challenge that a lot of their own recruits from within countries or those coming abroad are often not willing to do what they want. And we're actually seeing people leaving ISIS, people trying to flee. So they now have thousands of children. Here's a picture from Syria where they used children ages 5 to 14 to execute captured soldiers. But the reason I'm showing these pictures is because for many of us around the world, ISIS actually fills this role of being an idea of absolute evil. But at the end of the day, the majority of people joined ISIS, or at least those from within their countries, because they're trying to protect their families. Their cities might be occupied by ISIS, and they're worried if they don't join that they could be attacked or their family members could be attacked. They join because their cities like Fallujah and others are under siege by government or US-supported forces, and they need to be able to earn money and provide for their families. And for many of them, anyone who's under 30 years of age has never lived in a country at peace. And they may have had a father, an uncle, a brother who was killed or arrested, and they've joined to try and fight so that their communities' needs are protected. And we have about 30,000 who've joined from all over the world. This is a picture of 3 girls from Britain on their way to Syria, traveling through Turkey, who were recruited and went to fight. And my question is, what are we doing wrong that young people from all over the world are being inspired and mobilized to go take part in war, instead of being inspired and mobilized to see what they can do to innovate, to create, to solve problems? Today, ISIS has thousands of websites recruiting people. They're present on chat platforms. They make brilliant videos and recruitment materials, but there's not one website in the Arabic language which really inspires and mobilizes people for what they can do for peace building. And we need to change that. And another part of the answer is peace education and introducing this into our schools. All of us have conflicts. By introducing peace education to schools, we can learn the practical skills and tools that help us to deal with them more effectively. War isn't inevitable. It's the result of our systems and choices. And now, more than ever before in our history, we have the tools, the experience, and the knowledge that can help us to change that. But we need people to get involved. We need to overcome the myths, the systems, the investment that make war possible, and begin building peace practically. Thank you.